what we're going to go into is commercial models. And the reason we're going to do that is because as one scales Agile and starts to do much bigger projects, take on a lot more risk, then one of the challenges we're faced with is how do we share that risk with suppliers if we're the customer? And if we're the supplier, how do we differentiate ourselves in a market? And part of the way we can differentiate is by making a commitment. It is an increasingly commoditized market, and the more that we can do things that allow us to share risk and to make commitment, the more that we can demonstrate a differential. I'm going to introduce Dave, who's going to talk about the challenge of commitment in general, and then I'll talk about the impact that has on commercial models. So I'll introduce you to Dave.
Thank you very much, Rob. Good afternoon, everybody. A brief bit of background about me. I've been CIO at NetNames for the last 18 months. And before that, I spent around 15 years at BSkyB, managing a variety of development teams and departments and teams of software developers. For those of you who haven't heard of NetNames, we're the market leader in Europe for corporate domain name management and online brand protection services. A sort of medium-sized organisation. My IT department's only got about 70 people in it. Around 35 of those are software developers. And it's quite nice to have arrived in a company where both IT and the business as a whole are fully committed to Agile delivery. All our development teams follow classic Scrum techniques. And I like to think we do a fairly good job of delivering some high quality software to the business. But it's not without its challenges. And I just wanted to run through today a recent example of where our commitment to Agile was fairly strongly challenged by the business. And some of the problems that I've encountered fairly regularly on large scale Agile projects. So around the time I joined NetNames, April 2013, the company was facing the prospect of coping with the biggest change that the internet has seen in terms of domain name management. ICANN, who govern what goes on the internet, had opened up the top-level domain space, so the GTLDs, to allow a massive variety of domain names to challenge the traditional .com, .net, etc. So we've got the likes of .london, .agile, .guru, which is one of my favourites. But what it meant for us, well, in fact, what it meant for the public was that if you were looking for a nice little snappy domain name, it was great. You can get pretty much any domain name that you want. From our perspective, we were facing the challenge of moving from launching 1 or 2 new top-level domains per year to a situation where we were launching 15 to 20 top-level domains per week. Coupled with this was a huge increase, supposed to have gone there, a huge increase in the complexity of that work. There were some significant new interfaces, especially around the management of trademarks, allowing companies to purchase domains early. And that involved us building significant external interfaces as well. Now, at the same time as this, we were embarking on a project to completely rewrite our customer-facing portal, looking to improve performance and significantly improve the sort of usability of that portal. Now, I'll touch on that project first because it was by far the easiest and fits really nicely into a sort of classic Agile playbook about how to deliver software. We had a very clear product owner, a clear set of prioritized, or a clear and prioritized backlog of requirements, and general acceptance from everybody that we would deliver changes in an iterative way. We weren't being asked for any long-term commitment to dates, just the acceptance that we would be able to commit to what was going out in the next monthly customer release. And needless to say, it was an extremely successful, very pleasant project for anybody working on it. On the flip side, we had the new GTLD project, which had significant issues right from the start. Obviously, we were catering for multiple external deadlines driven by the new GTLD launch dates. We were struggling with the fact that right from the start, we knew we weren't going to be delivering or able to deliver all of the requirements for day one. And the business were quite keen to understand what operational workarounds they were going to need to put in place and what would be delivered at various points in time. So we were under a fair degree of pressure right from the start to deliver some very accurate estimates and give some solid commitments to the delivery of certain key bits of functionality. Now, we had a set of high-level requirements. We'd done some rough sizing on it. But my software delivery teams were understandably reluctant to be making commitments 8, 9, 10 months out. And because of this, we were challenged by the business to try and operate in a more traditional way. There was a lot of pressure for us to go away, gather all of the requirements up front. The primary reason behind it, so that we could get some accurate estimates and give some real commitments to delivery dates. Now, it's not an uncommon scenario. I've experienced it in the past, and I imagine there are heads of software delivery out there who've experienced these pressures as well. It's also not unreasonable behaviour from the business. They need to plan around a number of key launches, a number of key events, and quite rightly, they want to know what software is going to be available for them at certain points in that process. So it's reasonable of them to sort of try and press us for those dates. There was a general view that, Agile is fine for small projects. Agile is fine for fairly long-term product delivery, but that for significant projects such as this, with a number of external milestones and integrations, that we needed to revert to a more waterfall approach. In delving into it, actually what I discovered was that senior people didn't really care how we delivered. They didn't mind whether we were doing Agile, they didn't mind whether we were doing waterfall, they didn't really care at all. They just wanted for me to be able to stand there and give a cast iron commitment to dates. The problem is, as you've seen, commitment is difficult. And I think it's really important to point out that that's not because we've moved to doing things in an agile way. We were never good at it. I think we might possibly, or some of us, might be a little bit more honest these days about the fact that we can't commit to delivery. But the reason behind it is because software delivery is not a repeatable task. It's complicated. Each project is unique. And just like things like long-term weather forecasting, you need to accept at the very start that a large degree of uncertainty exists. History tells me that at the start of a 1 year, £1 million project, it's just as likely to spend 2 years and £2 million to deliver that full set of requirements. But like I say, that's not because of Agile or Waterfall, it's just because it's a complex business. Now, this isn't a message that senior management is comfortable to hear. We get an awful lot of pressure to make those commitments and to try to pretend that we have more confidence in what's going on than we actually do. And I think it's vital within the sort of software delivery arena, that we remain honest and true to ourselves and have those difficult conversations with the business about the degree of uncertainty that exists. Because if you can get to a situation where there's a common acceptance that elements of uncertainty exist and that your estimates aren't going to be specifically accurate, you can move the conversation to a better place, which is, what can we do to try and mitigate that uncertainty? What can we put in place to try and manage that level of uncertainty? This is where I think Agile does help. In my experience, it gives us far earlier visibility that those estimates were wrong. And most of the time they are wrong. Occasionally you get very lucky and they're too high, but most of the time it's the other way around. But most of the time they are wrong. And I think Agile gives us that ability to recognize that earlier and therefore to react sooner. If you look at a year-long project, 10 weeks into that project, delivering it in a waterfall way, if you're really lucky, you might be getting towards the end of your requirements gathering and analysis, and you're no closer at all to knowing what your delivery velocity is going to be and whether or not your estimates are wildly wrong. Whereas I think 10 weeks into an Agile project, you've got a good understanding of your velocity, and you can look and see, are we likely to be delivering 50, 75, 100% of this backlog? Now, of course, in order to do this, we have to have a clear plan going into the project. Even delivering in an Agile way, we need to have a clear plan. We need to have a clear backlog of requirements. They need to have been sized. We need to have an estimate of our delivery velocity. We need governance around it to make sure that we're tracking against these things and highlighting whether or not we're on track with what we predicted and changing course. But I think if we do those things, we do those basic things, it does give both IT and the business the opportunity to react earlier to issues that have been raised. Now, that can be improving the teams if we think they're not performing very well. It can be increasing the size of the teams. It could be changing the suppliers that we're working with. In many cases, it involves the business being able to start thinking about preparing operational workarounds for the fact that the software is coming late. And in extreme examples, it might be that it allows you to cancel the project early before you've gone through stuff. But if we assume that what I've said is correct, and at the start of a project, we really don't know how long it's going to take to deliver, how does it allow us to manage those commercial conversations when we're dealing with third-party suppliers at the start of a project? What can we do to try and protect the fact that there's this big level of unknown? And for some thoughts on that, I'll hand you back to Rob.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Dave. So if we, as Dave said, take it that making commitments is difficult, estimation is difficult, understanding where you're going is difficult, then how do we deal with it? Well, Agile, as we all know, deals with it by focusing on value, having a deep understanding of where value will accrue, and designing an incremental path that takes us to that. And that gives us a whole load of new risk mitigation options. It allows us to think differently about the way we structure our project. It allows us to make sure that if we don't get to where we need to be, at least we've delivered the highest value things, and that the operational workarounds will be the easiest ones to put in place. And that's great. It's great when you're working as a business and an internal IT division. But when things start to go wrong, they're still very difficult conversations. I'm sure if David had only got 50% of the way through his backlog when the launch date was available, he'd have been having some extremely difficult conversations with his business. If Dave had been an external supplier that had been paid a huge amount of money to get there, then he's going to be even more uncomfortable. The challenge there is that this gets even more difficult when working with external suppliers, but it's always been difficult in any way. A favourite example of mine was many years ago. I worked for a large systems integrator, and we had a fixed price project. It was going badly. We were all called into a room to discuss how we would deal with this, and the options on the table were pretty simple. One was we walk away and we get sued. The other one was we do the minimum amount of work we can possibly do, that if we do get sued, we'll survive. We won't lose much money. The next option was we'll do the minimum amount of work we can do to keep the customer happy to the point they won't sue us. So they're the three options on the table. At no point was an option on the table that we'll do what it says in the specification. Yep. We were happy to work around the vagaries of that. Now, if you're in an agile context where you're focusing on value, those vagaries are much more vague. Trying to specify value is hugely difficult. If you're in Dave's situation, the value proposition is how do we make as much money as possible when the new domain names launch? It would be great if you could engage an external supplier on that basis and say, we will pay you based on your ability to do this. But actually, an external supplier cannot do that on their own because that requires collaboration. That is the thing that is at the heart of Agile. It is we work together as a team to maximize that value. So any type of fixed outcome-based contract is immediately going to start causing challenges. It is going to fundamentally jar against the underlying principles of Agile. It is going to require some more upfront analysis, no matter how you structure this, whether you do it as fixed price for a whole project, fixed price per sprint, fixed price per deliverable. There has to be upfront analysis so that you can attach some sort of contractual basis around that, which delays the onset of work that adds value. It is anti-agile, really. It immediately reduces the opportunity for collaboration, because as soon as I delegate responsibility for you to deliver this value and ask you to take the risk of delivering that value, then you are going to say, actually, I don't want to collaborate through the process because I want it to be as static as possible, because I want it to be controlled and measured. And in that case, I also, as a customer, I can no longer control what's going on in your teams. I no longer can say, actually, I want you to work better here. I want you to change this, this, and this because I'm uncomfortable with it. I want to have retrospectives with you when I improve things, because as a supplier, I want to do it in the way that optimizes it for me, or the way I feel optimizes it for me. The reality is, in a fixed price type arrangement, I'm delegating the responsibility to the supplier. The supplier is going to charge me for some of that, and the risk is owned by that supplier. But actually it isn't. The risk owned by the supplier is only the risk that the software doesn't get delivered, not the much bigger risk that I cannot achieve my business ends. So I hope that makes sense. So the way that we've dealt with this typically in an Agile space is to move much more towards time material contracts. It has become the common, it's the norm, which is great because time material projects allow us to do all the things that we want to do in an Agile team. It allows us to collaborate. It allows us to focus together as a team on the value. But actually, we still need to think about the risk. And actually, the main thing we want to think about from a customer perspective is if things really go wrong, we want that supplier to share some of our pain. Why do we need that? Well, because things go wrong. Earlier this year, IndigoBlue was engaged by a customer to provide some delivery assurance on a project that they felt was going wrong. And it was going seriously wrong. It was a time materials project. The project had started out with a backlog that was sized at about 1,400 points, roughly about £1.4 million. It was costing about £1,000 per point. I won't go into the vagaries of that, but it was. The project started up with a velocity, and as one would expect, the first few sprints, the velocity was lower than one might hope. The team were becoming acquainted with the space, with each other, with the customer. But actually after the second, third, fourth, it didn't start to rise. And then it became apparent that actually the quality of what was being delivered wasn't great. And this was the point that we came in to look at it, did an audit and actually said, you're not in a very good place at all. The contract was good, it had a release clause we can terminate immediately, but actually we're 5 sprints in by this point. The customer spent well over £250,000, got nothing for it, and are throwing it away and starting again. Now, nobody wants to be in that position, so what we need to be somehow is get away from this and somehow put in place a model that allows us to share this risk. And actually, the next step on from this, I had a conversation yesterday morning with a very senior civil servant, and he was saying the biggest problem that he has at the moment in bringing on agile teams and onboarding them is that procurement in government are still wedded to fixed outcome-based contracts. They want time materials, so they don't want time materials, and they're absolutely banging up against it, and they are looking for new models that they can use. And actually, they are pushing Agile away as much as they can, despite the GDS strategy to introduce Agile. So one option is to think about what we can deliver. So we've talked about time materials very quickly, fixed price. As I've said, in an Agile team, what you are committing to is the creation of value. And you are working in a team, as a team, to maximize that value as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible. Now, as a supplier, you cannot do that on your own, or it's unlikely you can do that on your own. You are delivering a piece in a much bigger, wider business change. Some organizations may own the whole business change, but I think that is rare within this room. What the supplier can potentially do is commit to a production rate, i.e. potentially a velocity. Now that is their job. As a supplier, we are out there to deliver as much as we can, and to deliver that in the context of the business, thinking about where the value accrues and how they can work with that. So what we can potentially do is at the outset, size the project, look at the velocity profile, and then think about how the supplier might commit to that. Now, one wouldn't ask them to commit to delivering at the highest possible velocity, but certainly something above the lower one. And one might then start to think about service level contracts. So the sort of contracts that people are already familiar with, that procurement are already familiar with, around outsourcing other services. Now, it's not perfect. There are challenges around it, and I certainly don't have time to go through those challenges now, but would love to if people want to corner me later. But what one can put in place is a velocity, service level agreements, and potentially penalties, potentially bonuses that allow you to work in a collaborative, agile way, but also take away some pain if things go wrong. The good thing about this approach is it still requires you to be mature and sensible about your collaborative, agile approach. You have to put things in place that allow you to collaborate. You have to put things in place that allow both the supplier and the customer to vary where possible the targets. So if we start on day one and we find it's massively more complex than we thought, then we can have a mature conversation that says our velocity is going to be nowhere near what we thought it was going to be, and maybe downgrade those SLAs, maybe walk away if we're being unreasonable, but maybe downgrade them. Or actually, if it's much simpler and we're whizzing ahead, then maybe adjust them up. But it gives us the flexibility to work together. So what does this mean? Well, the great thing is that from a contractual perspective, these contracts are quite easy to write. I've done a lot of research recently around outcome-based contracts, fixed to value and to deliverables, and they are phenomenally complex contracts. And in the example I gave earlier about the failed project in the large systems integrator, those sort of contracts are complex and complex to administer. What is good about these sort of contracts is they're much simpler. So from a starting point, they look very similar to a typical T&M type contract. And T&M contracts should give power to the customer because the customer is paying on a day-by-day basis for each person. So they should allow you to wield that power. Ideally, they should have termination on demand. there is nothing worse than working on a sprint basis, trying to improve the process with a customer you're unhappy with, with a supplier you're unhappy with, and then get to the point where the relationship has broken down and suddenly find that there's a 1-month termination clause and you're paying hundreds of thousands of quid to someone you actually have completely fallen out with. There should be provisions for audit. This is a standard thing in service level agreements, service-based contracts. I do a lot of work around outsourcing of infrastructure, and in that context, there is always a provision for audit. There is also always a provision for comparison with externals and the opportunity to improve and suggest improvements. I believe, and it's something people don't do enough, there should be the opportunity to select and change team members. I know Dave does this all the time. It absolutely works. And as Dave said, you have to, in this sort of contract, you have to have an understanding where you are in the project. And to do that, you need a good governance mechanism, or however that might work, but that actually should be specified in the contract. Get that in up front. It is amazing, as a supplier, it is amazing how malleable we are in terms of changing contracts and putting things into contracts to satisfy a customer before that contract is signed. So that's what I would have anyway as a standard T&M contract, but on top of that then, you layer in the sort of thing that we're used to, and actually coming back to government, that government are used to, which is service level agreements. So here is my 100% level that we're aiming for, which would still probably be below what we think we can achieve, and then a 10% below that, so what's the penalty on that, a 10% below that, and then maybe once we get along below what will give us a minimum viable product, proper penalty clauses and real pain for the supplier. Potentially, we could also offer bonuses in this. What happens if we consistently achieve more? There should be payback in this. The key thing is they're very, very easy to write. Proper, simple contracts that change a dynamic and still allow us to be agile. I'll hand you back to Dave.
Thank you, Rob. I'll wrap up fairly quickly. I know everybody wants to go and get some lunch. I think just to summarise the key points, long-term commitment of software delivery is very, very hard. I would go as far as to say nigh on impossible to get right. I think it's important that we manage this with the business, that we don't give commitments that we can't meet, that we don't cave under the pressure to give commitments that we know aren't necessarily accurate. I think delivering in an agile way, certainly from my experience, allows us to acknowledge very early on whether or not those estimates are a long way off, and whether or not we need to start putting in place different mitigation strategies to get us back on track. Accepting all of that, certainly my opinion would be that when you're engaging with third parties, the only way forward is a variant on the time and materials basis. You'll never get a fixed term contract signed up to without paying significantly above the odds for the supplier taking that risk on board. At the very minimum, the points that Rob was raising there, immediate termination when it's not going well. He's right. We always interview the teams whenever we outsource. We interview the teams. I've got my good senior guys all over it. We sometimes drop people into the teams as well to mix them up and make sure things are going okay. But I think it is possible to get those commercial relationships going with suppliers. It's possible to move into a situation where it is truly a collaborative partnership between the IT department, the third-party supplier and the business, which is clearly where you want to be if you're going to deliver the most value and have the ability to change direction and be flexible. I think that's the key points. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.